Behind the brick walls of Toronto's Don Jail, screams once echoed through the night, not of criminals repenting, but of men trapped in a place darker than punishment itself. When the Don Jail first opened its heavy iron doors in 1864, it was hailed as a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, a symbol of justice, order, and moral reform in a rapidly growing Toronto. The city, still young and ambitious, wanted to prove that it could rise to the standards of Europe's great cities, not just in culture and commerce, but in law and correction. The Don Jail was supposed to represent that progress, a modern facility where criminals could be punished, disciplined, and ultimately reformed. But beneath the polished stone and intricate arches, the seeds of something far darker were being planted. The jail was built on the east bank of the Don River, a location chosen for its isolation from the city's heart. At the time, the area was surrounded by rolling farmland and thick forest, a perfect spot to keep society's unwanted far from the public eye. Designed by architect William Thomas, the building was grand and imposing, with its ornate facade, limestone walls, and central dome that was meant to evoke both fear and respect. The exterior reflected the moral ideals of the era, strength, control, and divine authority. But as time would reveal, beauty on the outside often masked horror within. Inside, the Don Jail followed a layout inspired by the panopticon concept, a design meant to let guards observe all prisoners from a single central point. In theory, this would ensure discipline and order. In practice, it became a tool of constant psychological torment. Prisoners never knew when they were being watched. The design created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear, the kind of fear that breaks a person long before any punishment does. When it opened, the Don Jail was promoted as a humane alternative to the chaotic prisons of the past. Reformers and politicians claimed it would embody the values of moral improvement. The idea was simple. Isolation, silence, and hard labor could cleanse a man's soul. But these noble ambitions soon clashed with reality. The first few years saw overcrowding almost immediately. The city was expanding faster than expected, and with that growth came crime, poverty, and desperation. What was meant to be a shining model of rehabilitation quickly began to crumble under its own weight. In those early days, prisoners were locked in small, cold cells with little ventilation or light. Each cell had a small window high enough that no one could look outside, a deliberate design to enforce reflection and repentance. But it was not reflection they found in those cells. It was despair. The silence that reformers once praised turned into a suffocating stillness. Guards walked the corridors with heavy keys clinking against their belts, and every turn of the lock echoed through the stone halls like a ghostly reminder that freedom was a world away. The Don Jail's administration believed in discipline through deprivation. Inmates were fed meager portions of bread, porridge, and water. Talking was forbidden. Work was mandatory. Men spent long days breaking rocks or cleaning corridors, only to return to the darkness of their cells. Reform through suffering became the unspoken rule. By the late 1800s, the Don Jail had already gained a reputation for cruelty. Visitors, including clergymen and civic leaders, who came expecting a model prison often left in shock. Reports described the air as foul and heavy, the cells damp and overcrowded, and the walls streaked with moisture from the nearby river. Diseases like tuberculosis spread easily, taking lives quietly behind bars while the city outside continued to grow and forget. Still, the Don Jail continued to operate under the belief that harshness would lead to redemption. Society at the time viewed prisoners not as humans to be rehabilitated, but as moral failures to be broken and remade. The architecture itself reflected that ideology, beautiful yet merciless. Every staircase, every barred window, every cell was built to remind inmates of the power the state held over their bodies and their souls. For many, the Don Jail stood as a warning to others. This is where crime leads. But for those inside, it became a lesson in endurance, a place where hope died quietly, and where the promise of reform turned into a lifelong sentence of pain. As the decades rolled on, the population of Toronto boomed. The prison, once considered state-of-the-art, began to feel more like an ancient relic. The walls started to decay, the corridors darkened with soot and neglect, and the voices of thousands of men who had passed through seemed to haunt its foundations. Even in its earliest years, the Don Jail's reputation began to shift from that of a house of correction to something far more sinister, a place where reform was replaced by ruin. The irony was cruel. A building designed to symbolize moral enlightenment became one of the darkest corners of Canadian justice. The grand limestone facade that once represented progress now hid stories of torment and loss. Those who walked past the Don Jail could see the elegant architecture, the symmetry, the arches, the clock tower, and imagine order within. But those who lived behind its bars knew the truth. The design was not about reform, it was about control. The thick stone walls did not protect society from criminals, they protected society from seeing what happened to them. The Don Jail was born from a dream of reform, but that dream was quickly corrupted by the reality of human cruelty and neglect. From the moment it opened in 1864, its fate was sealed, a place built with ideals but run with iron fists. And that was only the beginning. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Don Jail's grand vision of moral reform had already begun to collapse under the weight of its own iron bars. What was once promoted as a beacon of justice had become a festering pit of human suffering. The walls that had been designed to symbolize law and order were now closing in on far too many souls. Overcrowding had transformed the Don Jail into something more terrifying than punishment itself, a living nightmare of confinement, disease, and chaos. The prison was originally built to house 184 inmates. That number, according to the architects and reformers of the day, would allow for proper isolation, ensuring each prisoner had a cell for reflection and repentance. But as Toronto grew, crime rates rose and soon the cells began to overflow. By the early 1900s, over 600 prisoners were crammed into the same space, and by the mid-century, the jail's population had sometimes doubled its intended capacity. What was supposed to be a structured system of discipline turned into a chaotic human warehouse. Imagine a single stone cell, no larger than a small closet, meant for one man. Now picture 3 men squeezed inside. The air thick with sweat and the stench of unwashed bodies. The floor cold, damp, and littered with straw that hadn't been changed in weeks. At night, prisoners lay side by side, their shoulders pressed against stone and skin, barely able to move. There were no mattresses, no comfort, no privacy, only the unending closeness of other broken souls. The design of the Don Jail made the overcrowding even worse. The narrow corridors and spiraling iron staircases that had once seemed grand became choke points where guards could barely move. The ventilation system was poor, and the windows were small and barred so tightly that air barely circulated. In the summer, the heat trapped inside those walls became unbearable. Prisoners described it as breathing through a wet blanket. In winter, the cold was merciless. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. Men huddled together under thin, worn blankets, shivering through long, sleepless nights. The chaos inside was not just physical, it was psychological. The tension between inmates grew violent. With so many men locked in such a small space, fights broke out daily. Food rations were scarce and hunger made tempers short. Prison guards, outnumbered and undertrained, resorted to brutal methods to maintain control. Beatings were common. Solitary confinement, a narrow cell of darkness with no bed and no sound, was used as a weapon of discipline. Those who disobeyed even slightly were thrown into the hole, where days turned into weeks in total silence. Overcrowding didn't just breed violence, it bred despair. The Don Jail had become a place where the line between criminal and victim was erased. Men awaiting trial were held alongside murderers and repeat offenders. Some were locked up for petty crimes, theft, drunkenness, or even unpaid fines, and found themselves trapped in an environment that broke their spirit before they were ever sentenced. Many who entered the Don Jail as first-time offenders left as hardened criminals. The system that was meant to rehabilitate was now manufacturing more violence. Disease became an invisible executioner. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and skin infections spread rapidly through the overcrowded cells. With poor sanitation and almost no medical care, the sick were often left untreated. Some died quietly in their bunks. Others went mad from fever and confinement. The air itself was heavy with decay, thick with the smell of mold, sweat, and sickness. The river nearby, once a source of water, became a symbol of irony. So close, yet completely out of reach for those dying of thirst inside. Reports from the mid-1900s described the Don Jail as a disgrace to modern civilization. Even the guards called it a nightmare. One former officer described it as a place that changed men, prisoners, and staff alike into something less human. The staff turnover was constant. Many guards quit within months. Those who stayed often hardened themselves emotionally, believing that cruelty was the only way to survive. As the population swelled, the prison's infrastructure began to collapse. Plumbing failed, lights flickered, and sewage sometimes leaked into the lower levels. Rats and insects infested the corridors. The noise never stopped, clanging metal, shouts, footsteps, and the echo of distant suffering. There was no silence, no peace. Just a constant, grinding reminder of confinement. Prison reformers and journalists tried to raise awareness, but the system resisted change. Bureaucrats saw the Don jail as a necessary evil, a place to hide society's unwanted. Few politicians wanted to fund improvements and fewer still dared to visit. Those who did were horrified. One visitor in the 1930s wrote, "It is a wonder men come out alive from this place. The body may survive but the soul does not." Even as late as the 1970s and 1980s, conditions remained appalling. By then the Don jail was infamous across Canada. The media called it Canada's shame. Inmates rioted, protested, and pleaded for better conditions, but little changed. The overcrowding persisted and the violence worsened. The prison was no longer a facility, it was a pressure cooker ready to explode at any moment. Inside those overcrowded walls, humanity was stripped away piece by piece. A new prisoner entering the Don jail for the first time would be overwhelmed by the noise, the smell, and the sense of hopelessness that hung in the air. The moment the heavy iron doors clanged shut behind him, he knew this was not a place for reform. This was a place to be forgotten. Perhaps the most tragic part of the Don jail's overcrowding crisis was how it mirrored society's neglect. Outside, Toronto was thriving, skyscrapers rose, neighborhoods expanded, and the city modernized. But just across the Don River, men were still living in 19th century squalor. It was as if time had stopped inside those walls. The contrast was almost poetic. A growing, modern city trying to bury its own sins behind a beautiful facade. Overcrowding wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a moral one. It revealed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to believe in justice and reform but turned its back on those it condemned. The Don jail became a mirror reflecting that contradiction, a place where civilization's progress collided with its cruelty. By the end of the 20th century, the overcrowding had reached its peak. Even government officials could no longer deny the truth. Inspectors described conditions as deplorable, inhumane, and beyond repair. Some cells still had iron chains bolted to the walls, relics of a darker age. The noise, the heat, and the overcrowding had driven many inmates to madness. The Don jail was no longer just a prison, it had become a monument to suffering. Every inch of its stone walls bore the marks of desperation. Scratches, carvings, names of the forgotten etched into the limestone as if begging history to remember them. And yet, despite the horror, the Don jail continued to operate. The doors kept closing, the cells kept filling, and the chaos never stopped. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the Don jail's name had become synonymous with one phrase, hell on earth. What was once Toronto's proud monument of justice had deteriorated into a fortress of misery. Its walls, blackened by time and despair, had absorbed the cries, curses, and final breaths of generations of men who entered those gates and never truly left. If the word prison meant punishment, the Don jail gave it new meaning. It was not just a place to serve a sentence. It was a place that broke a man's body and spirit long before the law said his time was done. The conditions inside had become nightmarish. The cells were so overcrowded that inmates often had to take turns sleeping. The thin mattresses were filthy, crawling with lice, and many slept on the bare stone floor. The air was heavy, thick with sweat, decay, and the smell of human waste that came from overflowing toilets and buckets. There was no escape from the stench. It followed you like a curse. Even basic human dignity was stripped away. Showers were rare, sometimes once a week, sometimes not at all. Soap was a luxury. The water, when it came, was cold and brown. Rats scurried across the floors at night, and roaches infested every corner. Prisoners were often forced to clean their own cells with whatever scraps they could find, though nothing could cleanse the rot that had seeped into the walls over the decades. Inmates described hearing the building itself, the creaking of old pipes, the clang of doors, the echoing footsteps of guards in the dark. But what haunted them most were the sounds that never stopped. The moans, the cries, the desperate prayers of men who had lost hope. It wasn't only the filth that made the Don jail infamous, it was the brutality. The guards, often overworked and underpaid, became part of the cycle of cruelty. Violence was routine. Beatings were given for the smallest infractions, talking out of turn, disobedience, or even looking the wrong way. Solitary confinement was used not as discipline but as torture. Men were locked in pitch-black cells for days or weeks, deprived of light, sound, and human contact. When they emerged, many were broken, trembling, muttering, or simply blank, their minds erased by the silence. One former inmate later said, "You didn't have to die to go to hell. You just had to be sent to the Don." The guards justified their actions as maintaining order, but in truth, the jail had long since lost any sense of order. Fights broke out constantly, over food, over space, over nothing at all. The stronger preyed on the weaker. The guards rarely intervened unless it was to punish both sides. Blood often stained the stone floors before the night was over. The psychological torment was just as cruel as the physical. Prisoners were kept in isolation for so long that they forgot what sunlight felt like. The tiny windows high above the cells let in only thin slivers of light, never enough to see the sky. The days blurred into nights, the hours into years. For many, time stopped mattering. Letters from inmates, smuggled out through sympathetic guards or family members, painted a horrifying picture of daily life. One wrote, "It's a place that kills the soul before the body. You can feel yourself disappear here." Another compared the experience to being buried alive, aware, breathing, but already forgotten. Over the years, journalists and reformers tried to expose what was happening behind the Don jail's walls. But when stories of abuse reached the public, many citizens shrugged. To them, criminals deserved what they got. That indifference allowed the horror to continue for decades. The system thrived on silence. The silence of prisoners, the silence of guards, and the silence of society. The Canadian government received repeated reports of inhumane conditions, overcrowding, disease, and brutality, but very little changed. Committees were formed, inspections were made, and promises were given. Yet the walls of the Don remained as they were, cold, cruel, and unrepentant. Even the architecture itself seemed to conspire against hope. The stone corridors amplified every sound, every cry for help, every scream, every echoing footstep. The light was dim and flickering, casting long shadows across the walls, giving the impression that the building was alive, watching its captives with unseen eyes. The nickname Hell on Earth didn't come from journalists or politicians. It came from the prisoners themselves. Word spread from cell to cell, from one generation to the next. They said the Don was cursed, that no man left unchanged and no soul left clean. Those who managed to survive their time inside often carried the scars for life. Former inmates spoke of nightmares that haunted them for years. The smell, the noise, the screams. Some could never walk past the building again without trembling. Others took their own lives, unable to forget what they had endured inside those walls. As Canada moved into the modern era, other prisons were built, newer and more humane. But the Don jail remained frozen in time, a relic of cruelty that refused to die. It stood there, looming over the city like a reminder of everything civilization tried to forget. Visitors who toured the facility in later years described the same chilling sensation. As soon as they stepped through the gates, the air changed. It felt heavier, colder, almost alive. Some claimed to hear whispers echoing through the halls, or to feel a strange pressure on their chest. Paranormal investigators would later call it one of the most haunted places in Toronto. But to those who knew its history, the explanation was simpler. The Don jail didn't need ghosts. Its horror was already real. Inmates in the 1950s and 1960s began carving words into the walls. Names, dates, prayers, curses. Some wrote to be remembered. Others wrote to mark their suffering. "God save me," one carving read. Another said, "This is hell." Those words still remain faintly etched into the limestone, long after the prisoners who wrote them have vanished from the world. Every corner of the Don jail told a story, stories of violence, loss, fear, and regret. The staircases worn smooth by the boots of guards. The iron doors rusted from decades of sweat and blood. The cells still bearing scratches from desperate hands. Each mark was a testament to the pain endured within those walls. By the 1960s, Toronto citizens began calling for the prison's closure. But it would take half a century more before that wish was granted. For generations, men continued to enter and leave the Don jail, some walking out alive, others not. And the stories they told, whispered in fear, spread through the city like ghostly echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. To the outside world, the Don jail was just another building, a relic of Toronto's past. But to those who knew its truth, it was something far more sinister. It was the city's shame, a place where justice became cruelty and punishment became pain. Inside those walls, the Don jail didn't just hold prisoners. It devoured them. Deep within the stone corridors of the Don jail lay a secret that few ever saw. A chamber hidden from the public eye, a room where Canada's justice system crossed the thin line between law and death. It was known simply as the Gallows. From the moment the Don jail opened in 1864, it was designed not just to confine men, but to end their lives. Executions were an accepted part of justice then. Public hangings had once been common in Canada. But as society grew more civilized, those final acts of punishment were moved indoors, away from crowds and cameras, hidden behind thick limestone walls. The Don jail became one of the few places in the country authorized to carry out the death penalty. The gallows were located in a small, windowless room, accessible only through a narrow corridor guarded by steel doors. It was simple and unremarkable: a wooden scaffold, a rope hanging still, a trapdoor beneath the condemned. For those who were sent there, the walk to that room was called the last 13 steps. Those steps became legendary among prisoners. Men whispered about them in the cells at night, the hollow sound of boots echoing down the corridor, the heavy silence that followed. Everyone knew that once those 13 steps began, there was no coming back. The first executions at the Don jail took place in the late 19th century, but it was in the early 1900s that the gallows saw the most use. Murderers, thieves, and men accused of crimes they swore they didn't commit, all met the same fate at the end of a rope. Some died quickly, others didn't. The hangman's job was to make it clean, but mistakes were common. The wrong drop length, a knot tied too tight, or a nervous executioner could turn a quick death into a slow strangulation. Witnesses described it as quiet horror, a kind of death that made the living question whether justice had truly been served. The condemned were often kept in tiny cells near the gallows, isolated from the rest of the population. The guards called it death row, though it was nothing more than a few narrow rooms lit by a single bulb. Here men waited in silence for their final day, some for weeks, others for months. They were given little to do but think, and thinking was its own form of torture. Every sound, the footsteps of a guard, the turning of a key, the creak of the floorboards, could be the signal that it was time. Prisoners described the air in those cells as different, heavier, colder. Some spoke to priests through the bars, confessing sins they barely remembered committing. Others refused to speak at all. They sat motionless on their bunks, eyes fixed on the wall, as if already seeing something beyond it. At dawn on execution day, the ritual began. Guards would approach the cell quietly, carrying chains and black cloth. The condemned man would be handcuffed, his arms held tight, and a black hood placed over his head. There was no speech, no ceremony, no crowd, just the shuffle of boots on stone as they led him down the hall. Those who witnessed these final walks said the silence was worse than the act itself. The echo of the chains, the sound of breathing beneath the hood, the smell of sweat and fear, all of it combined into a moment that lingered long after the rope went still. Some prisoners walked with courage. Others had to be dragged. A few fainted before they reached the scaffold. The chaplain would whisper a final prayer. The hangman would pull the lever. And then there was only the sound of the trapdoor falling open. Between 1900 and 1962, dozens of men met their end in the Don jail's execution chamber. But one particular event sealed the prison's dark legacy in Canadian history, the last double hanging in Canada, carried out in 1962. On December 11, 1962, two men, Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin, were executed side by side in the Don jail. Their crimes were different, their stories unconnected, but they shared one fate. Lucas was an American-born pimp accused of murder. Turpin had shot a police officer during a robbery. Both were sentenced to death by hanging. In the early morning hours, guards escorted them separately to the gallows. Reporters waited outside in the cold, unable to see what was happening inside, but knowing that history was being made. At 12:02 a.m., the trapdoor opened for the first time. A few minutes later, it opened again. It was the last time in Canadian history that the state took a life by execution. After that night, the gallows were sealed. Canada's government began moving toward abolishing the death penalty entirely, a process that would officially end in 1976. But the Don jail would forever carry the stain of those final moments. Even after executions stopped, the stories didn't. Guards spoke of strange occurrences around the gallows room, cold spots, flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched. Some refused to enter the chamber alone. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, or to see shadows moving when no one was there. Whether real or imagined, the building's energy had changed. Death had left a mark that time could not erase. The chamber remained untouched for decades. The rope was removed, but the beams and trapdoors stayed in place. Visitors who toured the old jail before its closure said standing in that room felt suffocating. Some described an overwhelming sadness, others a sense of guilt, as if the building itself remembered every soul it had claimed. The Don jail's role as an execution site became one of the most haunting chapters in Canadian penal history. It was more than a place of punishment, it was an altar of final judgment. The same city that built cathedrals and schools had also built a house where justice ended in death. Over time, the gallows came to symbolize the futility of the system itself, how a structure meant to reform had instead become a machine of destruction. The echoes of those last 13 steps still linger in Toronto's memory, even as the city around the prison has transformed into a landscape of glass towers and busy streets. To this day, the gallows room remains one of the most chilling parts of the old Don jail. Even with the building now integrated into a modern hospital complex, the space is treated with quiet reverence. Not celebration, not curiosity, but remembrance. It is said that when you walk through those halls now, there is a moment where the air feels colder, where time seems to pause, and where you can almost hear the faint creak of rope above you. It's as if the Don jail itself refuses to forget the lives it once ended. Justice, once served there by hanging, has long since been replaced by healing. But the ghosts of the past still remain, whispering through the corridors, reminders of a time when punishment was final, and mercy was nowhere to be found. The Don jail's gallows stand not as a symbol of justice, but as a monument to its darkest failure. A place where the law took life in the name of order, and where the echoes of those last 13 steps still haunt the conscience of a nation. The Don jail's walls were built to contain the worst of society, hardened criminals, gangsters, and murderers. Over the decades, the prison became infamous not only for its inhumane conditions and executions, but also for the notable inmates who passed through its gates. Each man brought with him a story, some of cruelty, others of cunning, and many tried, against impossible odds, to escape the clutches of a prison designed to crush the human spirit. One of the most infamous residents was Rocco Perry, often called Canada's King of Bootleggers. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s, Perry built a criminal empire smuggling alcohol into Ontario and beyond. Yet even a man of his resourcefulness could not outwit the Don jail's iron walls. He served years in the facility and his time there became legendary. Stories circulated that Perry, though confined, maintained a calculated calm. A prisoner who observed the guards, memorized routines, and quietly plotted. For men like him, the Don jail was a battlefield of wits as much as a cage of stone. Then there were the violent offenders whose reputations alone made guards wary. Murderers and gang members filled the cells, often under constant threat of attack from fellow inmates. Rival gangs inside the prison carried their conflicts over into the narrow corridors. Fights erupted at all hours, sometimes leaving men bloodied, bruised, or worse. The guards, while enforcing order, often turned a blind eye, sometimes for bribes, sometimes out of sheer fear of retaliation. With such dangerous occupants, escape attempts were inevitable. Despite its towering stone walls, heavy iron doors, and meticulously planned surveillance, prisoners never gave up hope of freedom. Over the decades, the Don jail became the site of countless escape attempts. Some daring, some absurd, all desperate. One famous story involves a group of inmates in the 1930s who tried to tunnel their way out. Armed only with improvised tools, they spent months secretly digging beneath the stone floors of the cell block. Guards noticed nothing until a sudden collapse revealed the hidden tunnel. The men were caught before they could flee, but their audacity became part of the Don jail's lore. Other escape attempts relied on cunning and bribery. Some prisoners tried to exploit corrupt guards, offering money or favors in exchange for keys or oversight. Occasionally these attempts almost succeeded, but the prison's design, narrow corridors, barred windows, and high observation towers, made it nearly impossible to vanish once outside. The few who did succeed became legends in their own right, their escapes whispered about by inmates for years afterward. Even the most violent criminals sometimes used ingenuity over brute force. In one particularly audacious attempt, a man fashioned a rope from bedsheets to scale the outer wall. As he climbed, a guard spotted him, triggering an alarm that echoed through the stone halls. He fell before reaching freedom, but his courage became part of the mythos surrounding the prison. The inmate's resilience was matched only by the Don jail's ability to crush it. Every escape attempt was met with stricter security, harsher punishment, and reinforced surveillance. Solitary confinement became a favored method of controlling those who dared to challenge the prison. Men who had dared to dream of freedom found themselves locked in darkness, stripped of hope, and subjected to weeks of silence. The punishment was as psychological as it was physical. Notorious inmates often influenced the culture of the prison itself. Their presence inspired fear, admiration, or both. Some men became informal leaders, organizing small factions, controlling illicit trade within the jail, or providing protection to weaker prisoners. Others used the notoriety to manipulate guards, gaining favors or access to privileges denied to the average inmate. One lesser-known figure, Edgar McInnes, attempted multiple escapes over his 5-year incarceration. His persistence and cunning earned him a strange kind of respect among both inmates and guards. He tried everything, smuggling tools, bribing a guard, and even disguising himself as a delivery worker during a transport. Every attempt failed, but each effort became a story retold in the dark corners of the cell blocks. The combination of dangerous inmates and constant escape attempts created an environment of perpetual tension. Guards had to walk the corridors with caution, aware that a single misstep could result in an inmate attacking them. Prisoners had to remain alert, constantly calculating threats from rivals. The Don Jail was a crucible where the weakest perished, the cunning survived, and the violent thrived, if only temporarily. In some ways, the notoriety of the inmates fed the jail's reputation. High-profile prisoners ensured that stories of brutality, cunning escapes, and violent conflicts reached the public. Newspapers occasionally reported on these men, sensationalizing their crimes and daring escapes. The media coverage only reinforced the perception of the Don Jail as one of Canada's most dangerous and infamous prisons, a place where lawbreakers were tested to their limits. Even as time went on, the combination of infamous inmates and escape attempts created a kind of legend. Stories of narrow escapes, failed plots, and cunning manipulation circulated not just inside the prison, but throughout Toronto and beyond. To the outside world, the Don Jail was more than a building. It was a living character, a place of fear, respect, and fascination. These stories of escape and notoriety weren't just entertainment. They were a reflection of the harsh reality inside the jail. Overcrowding, brutal guards, and inhumane conditions made escape a form of survival. For many prisoners, the idea of leaving, even if just in imagination, was the only thing keeping their sanity intact. Every failed attempt became a lesson, every punishment a reinforcement of the prison's iron grip. By the time the Don Jail closed in 2013, it had housed thousands of prisoners, countless notorious figures, and an untold number of would-be escapees. The building itself seemed to absorb their stories, etching them into the stone, the bars, and the corridors. Visitors today can still feel that energy, the sense that history has left an indelible mark on the walls. The combination of infamous inmates, violent clashes, and relentless escape attempts cemented the Don Jail's reputation as a place where ordinary rules of society no longer applied. It was a world unto itself, where danger lurked at every corner, where courage and cunning were sometimes the only currency, and where freedom remained a distant, tantalizing dream. In the end, the Don Jail wasn't just a prison. It was a test of human will, a theater of desperation, and a crucible of infamy. And for every man who walked its corridors, whether hardened criminal or first-time offender, the memory of those walls would haunt them forever. As the decades passed, the Don Jail's reputation as a brutal and unforgiving prison grew. By the mid-20th century, it had become clear to many outside observers that the conditions inside were not merely harsh, they were inhumane. Overcrowding, abuse, disease, and neglect were no longer isolated complaints. They had become systemic issues, exposing one of Canada's most chilling contradictions. A society that prided itself on civility, yet allowed cruelty to persist behind stone walls. The first public scandals began to emerge in the 1950s and 1960s, when journalists and social reformers began reporting on the conditions inside the Don Jail. Newspapers ran shocking exposés. Men locked in cells with 3 times the intended capacity, inadequate food, unsanitary toilets, and guards who routinely beat and humiliated prisoners. The articles described how inmates were often left untreated for illnesses such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, and severe infections. Some reports even documented deaths that could have been prevented with proper care. One journalist described a visit to the jail as entering a living tomb. He recounted the oppressive heat of summer, the freezing cold of winter, and the overpowering stench of unwashed bodies and decay. Prisoners, he wrote, were reduced to mere shadows of men, stripped of dignity, hope, and in many cases, sanity. The public was shocked, or at least some of it. Many citizens still viewed prisoners as criminals undeserving of empathy, which allowed the scandals to simmer without immediate action. Yet the reports could not be ignored forever. By the 1970s, the outcry became impossible to dismiss. Human rights organizations, lawyers, and academics began to take notice. They documented violations that would shock even the most hardened observers. Guards using excessive force, inmates being denied proper nutrition, rampant overcrowding, and the systematic psychological torment of solitary confinement. Testimonies from former prisoners revealed patterns of abuse that suggested not just negligence, but deliberate cruelty. One particularly damning report described the cell blocks as machines for breaking men. It recounted incidents of guards deliberately provoking fights among inmates, withholding medical care, and punishing prisoners for reporting mistreatment. The report concluded that the Don Jail's administration had long abandoned any pretense of reform, focusing instead on maintaining control through fear and intimidation. The media coverage combined with legal advocacy began to put real pressure on government officials. Politicians could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that the Don Jail was failing its most basic responsibilities. Committees were formed, investigations were launched, and promises were made. Yet progress was slow. Funding for repairs and modernization was repeatedly postponed, leaving the building to decay further. By this point, the jail had become a symbol of systemic failure, an institution whose cruelty was as much a reflection of society as of its walls. During this period, lawsuits and legal challenges began to mount. Lawyers representing former inmates filed claims citing violations of human rights, cruel and unusual punishment, and neglect. Court documents painted a grim picture. Overcrowded cells, lack of medical care, mental abuse, and physical assaults by guards. The legal pressure forced authorities to confront the undeniable truth. The Don Jail was no longer just a failing prison. It was a public scandal. The scandals also drew attention to specific incidents of abuse that horrified the public. For example, reports emerged of guards using punishment cells for weeks at a time, keeping men in darkness with no food or water beyond the minimum required to survive. Other reports documented beatings that left prisoners unconscious, with no investigation or accountability for the guards involved. Families of inmates began speaking out, revealing that their loved ones were often returned in worse condition than when they entered. By the 1980s, the Don Jail's notoriety had reached international attention. Human rights groups cited it as one of the most dangerous prisons in North America, highlighting how its overcrowding, abuse, and neglect created a system of suffering unmatched in the region. The prison became a case study in how neglect, cruelty, and corruption could combine to create an environment worse than the crimes it punished. Public outrage gradually forced political action. Promises were made to improve conditions, renovate the facilities, and reduce overcrowding. Yet many improvements came too late for those who had already suffered, and for decades the jail remained a place of fear and misery. Even as renovations were planned, the reputation of the Don Jail as a place of horror persisted, reinforced by the stories of those who survived its walls. The human rights outcry also had a lasting cultural impact. Documentaries, books, and newspaper articles recounted the suffering of prisoners, ensuring that the lessons of the Don Jail were not forgotten. Activists argued that society could no longer ignore the human cost of incarceration, that prisons were not simply warehouses for criminals, but institutions with ethical obligations to preserve dignity and life. Despite its notoriety, the Don Jail remained operational until 2013, when it was finally closed. By then, it had been the site of over 150 years of human suffering, housing thousands of men under conditions widely recognized as inhumane. The closure itself was the result of decades of public pressure, legal challenges, and moral condemnation. It was only through persistent activism, journalism, and legal advocacy that the jail's legacy of cruelty was formally acknowledged. Today, as part of the Bridgepoint Health complex, the Don Jail serves as a heritage site, a reminder of the abuses that once occurred within its walls. The preserved sections of the prison allow visitors to see, firsthand, the conditions that sparked public scandal and human rights outcry. The building stands as a testament to the consequences of unchecked power, overcrowding, and systemic neglect. The scandals and human rights campaigns surrounding the Don Jail were not merely about reforming a building. They were about acknowledging the humanity of those imprisoned, challenging society's indifference, and ensuring that future generations would remember the lessons of cruelty and the cost of silence. The Don Jail's history reminds us that prisons are more than institutions of confinement. They are reflections of society's values, for better or worse. And in the case of the Don Jail, the scandals and human rights outcry revealed a society forced to confront the dark consequences of ignoring its moral responsibilities. Even decades after the closure, the Don Jail remains a symbol of what happens when cruelty is institutionalized, when oversight fails, and when human dignity is disregarded. The stories of abuse, the public scandals, and the legal battles serve as a permanent warning that the line between justice and cruelty is thinner than most of us would like to admit. The story of the Don Jail does not end with brutality, overcrowding, or executions. Its walls, which for nearly 150 years had echoed with the cries of despair, violence, and fear, would eventually witness a radical transformation, from a symbol of punishment to a site of remembrance and heritage. Yet the journey from hell on earth to preservation was neither immediate nor easy. It was a slow, painstaking process, shaped by decades of public outrage, legal scrutiny, and societal reflection. By the late 20th century, the Don jail's reputation had reached a point of no return. Media exposés, investigative reports, and legal challenges had exposed the harsh realities of life behind its walls. Overcrowding, disease, abuse, and inhumane treatment. The scandals of the 1970s and 1980s had forced politicians to acknowledge what Toronto citizens already knew: the building could no longer serve as a modern correctional facility. In the 1990s, discussions about closure gained momentum. Correctional authorities argued that the old stone structure, despite its historical significance, was outdated and incapable of meeting contemporary standards for prisoner safety, rehabilitation, and human rights. Plans were drawn for new facilities with modern technology, better living conditions, and improved rehabilitation programs. Yet, closing the Don jail meant confronting its dark legacy, a legacy of suffering, death, and systemic cruelty that had defined a generation of Toronto's incarcerated. Finally, in 2013, the decision was made: the Don jail would officially close. Its remaining inmates were transferred to modern correctional facilities, leaving behind the echoing corridors that had once trapped thousands. For the first time in nearly 150 years, the heavy iron doors closed, not to admit new prisoners, but to begin the process of preservation and transformation. The closure marked a turning point in public consciousness. No longer was the Don jail simply a functional institution of incarceration. It became a historic monument, a reminder of the mistakes and excesses of the past. Historians, preservationists, and city planners collaborated to incorporate the site into the Bridgepoint Health complex, ensuring that its stone walls would endure, even as its function changed. The transformation required careful planning. Sections of the prison that had witnessed the worst abuses were preserved. Cells, corridors, and even the infamous death row were maintained as part of the heritage site. Visitors today can see the tiny, overcrowded cells, the narrow corridors, and the remnants of the execution chamber. The preservation effort sought not to sanitize the Don jail's history, but to present it honestly, showing the realities of incarceration in 19th and 20th century Toronto. Yet transformation was not merely architectural, it was symbolic. By turning the Don jail into a heritage site, Toronto acknowledged the suffering of those who had lived, and sometimes died, within its walls. The building became a living classroom, teaching visitors about the evolution of Canada's justice system, the human cost of neglect, and the consequences of cruelty institutionalized over generations. The story of the Don jail's transformation also reflects broader societal change. Where once harsh punishment and public indifference were accepted, there is now recognition of human rights, rehabilitation, and ethical responsibility. The shift from operational prison to heritage site mirrors the shift in societal values, a city confronting its past rather than burying it. Despite its grim history, the Don jail has found a new purpose. Parts of the structure now serve educational and historical functions, hosting tours, exhibits, and events that recount the lives of prisoners, guards, and reformers. The preserved architecture allows visitors to experience the claustrophobia, the tension, and the oppressive atmosphere that made the Don jail infamous. Yet, standing in these halls today, one also senses the resilience of memory, a testament to those who endured, survived, and bore witness to the prison's darkest years. The integration of the Don jail into the Bridgepoint Health complex is particularly poignant. Once a site of suffering, the building now sits adjacent to a place of healing, creating a stark contrast between past and present. Patients, staff, and visitors pass by the old prison walls, perhaps unaware of the full history, yet the preserved structure silently narrates a story of transformation, from punishment to preservation, from despair to reflection. For historians and human rights advocates, the Don jail serves as a cautionary tale. Its closure underscores the dangers of neglect, the consequences of systemic cruelty, and the moral responsibility of society toward those it incarcerates. The preserved structure allows for reflection, teaching modern Canadians the importance of reform, oversight, and humane treatment within correctional institutions. The Don jail's transformation also invites contemplation about memory and legacy. How should society remember places of suffering? Should they be erased, rebuilt, or preserved? Toronto chose preservation, understanding that forgetting the past risks repeating it. The stone walls, iron bars, and narrow cells now serve as historical witnesses, holding the stories of thousands of men who passed through the jail. Some guilty, some innocent, all trapped by circumstance, fear, or the rigid structures of law. In the end, the closure and transformation of the Don jail represent more than the end of a prison. They symbolize the triumph of accountability over indifference, remembrance over erasure, and reflection over denial. What was once considered one of Canada's most dangerous and infamous prisons is now a heritage site, offering lessons in justice, human rights, and the human cost of systemic failure. Visitors walking through the preserved corridors today are confronted with the echoes of history, footsteps that are no longer there, whispers of men long gone, and the lingering sense of lives lived under extreme conditions. The Don Jail reminds us that history is never fully behind us. It remains in the walls, in the architecture, and in the memory of those who experienced it. From its opening in 1864 to its closure in 2013, the Don Jail witnessed the worst of human cruelty and the resilience of human survival. Its transformation into a heritage site ensures that its story, a story of suffering, scandal, and ultimate reflection, will continue to educate and haunt future generations. The Don Jail's legacy, once defined by pain and fear, has been rewritten as a testament to the power of reflection, the importance of justice reform, and the enduring need to remember the past honestly. The prison may be closed, but its walls continue to speak, a silent, solemn reminder of what humanity is capable of, and what it must never allow to happen again.